The confederation or agglomeration of the Alemanni, a similar mixture and reappearance under a collective name of the tribes of the Suevi, had been forced south about the time of Caracalla. By a variety of adventures, partly peaceful and partly aggressive, they established themselves in the southwest of Germany between the Saxon and Frank nationalities to the north and the Burgundians and Roman provinces to the south. From Mainz to the Lake of Constance, from Mainz to the Lake of Constance to the west, as far as the river Lech to the eastward. They thus occupied eastern or German Switzerland, as it is now called, and that part of modern Germany which formerly bore the name of Swabia, and which is now roughly represented by the kingdom of Württemberg, and the southern part of the Grand Duchy of Baden. Western or French Switzerland was a part of the kingdom of the Burgundians. The name of Alemannia continued to be given in legal documents throughout the Middle Ages to these lands, including Alsace and Swabia, but to all intents and purposes the name of Swabia and the Swabians succeeds historically to its importance at an earlier period in the name of Alemannia being given, sometimes in Latin and almost universally in French, to the whole of Germany. Beyond the Lech to the east lay the Bavarians, Boiorians, a strong and important nation who, like the Alemanni, had been forced into the southern and western position as compared with their original seats at the opening of history. The Bavarians represent the Marcomanni, or some more mixed agglomeration of tribes who drove the Boi, a Gaelic tribe, out of Bohemia, and becoming Boiwara, moved on into the modern Bavaria under the pressure by the Czechs. Then as now the German nations were bounded on the east by vast hordes of Slavonians and somewhat later by Tartaric or Turanian tribes who were gradually driving them westward, and as for the last few centuries they have themselves been driven eastward. Under the name of Antis and Slavonians, Slavonic tribes occupied Poland and modern Prussia, as whence they pressed on the Saxons in Mecklenburg, as Czechs on the Boyans in Bohemia, and as Serbs and Slavs in Hungary on the Illyrian provinces of Rome. The Slavonians were themselves pressed on the east, and sometimes penetrated by the more distant Tartaric races, from which sprang the Magyars, or later Hungary. Bohemia was the historical home of the Boi, or Bavarians. Forced before the Czechs, they moved west and south into the modern Bavaria and Austria, and there under their king Theodo the Agilolfing, they were established by Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths, as a bulwark of his empire against the aggressions of the Franks. The whole south of Germany, as far as the South Tyrol, southwards, and Hungary eastwards, was thus Bavarian, and continued to bear the name until the March of Austria was created out of the eastern half of it, and the territory assumed its modern and present dimensions. The Saxons, who like the Franks had probably migrated little within the historic period, but like the Franks and Alemanni had substituted a new national name for a quantity of tribal distinctions, covered the north of Germany from the line of the Franks and the Rhine to the neighborhood of the Oder eastward, where they abut in the Wends. Between them and the Franks and Bavarians lay 3 or 4 ancient small nations, which had preserved their tribal identity: the Chatti, or Hessians, the Thuringians, and the inhabitants of Meissen and Lausitz, Misnia and Lusatia, which at a later period developed into the Marches, bearing those names later still into the Electorate and Duchy of Saxony, and ultimately into the Kingdom of Saxony. The country now called Saxony was no part of the ancient territory of the Saxons or Lower Saxony, which included Westphalia, and the territory of the Kingdom of Hanover, which with much that lies south of them. And thus a great part of the Kingdom of Prussia before 1866. In fact, the Kingdom of Prussia as it existed before 1866, i.e., the West Prussia of Brandenburg and its accretions, not the eastern part, roughly, represented the ancient Saxony, from the northern part of this Saxony towards Denmark, the land of the Jutes, Angles, and Frisians, came our own forefathers in the 5th century to Britain. And this is the Saxonia, the Old Saxony, as it is called by Bede, and the early chroniclers, which was converted by the missions of Boniface and his predecessors, who came from the monasteries of Wessex and Northumbria. These, then, are the materials out of which a historical nation of Germans has to be constructed. The initiation of union comes in the shape of the conqueror Clovis. Of course, it will be understood that, besides these great tribal divisions, or national divisions, as they might be called, there were innumerable small tribes, some ranging under these conglomerate names, and some not included under them, but too small and obscure much to affect general history. It is upon these great ones that the Germany of history is based, and to their rivalries, their amalgamations, attractions, and repulsions. That the history of Germany, read analytically, must trace the mainspring of its movement and its power, and the occasions of its weakness. Clovis, whose career in its details it is unnecessary to describe, was originally king of the Salian Franks, but by his fame as a warrior and personal influence united the whole of the Franks under his sway and began the foundation of a kingdom which developed into the Western Empire. It will be remembered how in the year 486 he vanquished Syagrius and acquired the remaining territories of Rome and Gaul, how in 1496 he conquered the Alemanni at Sulpic, and in 507 the Visigoths at Vouglé. The conquest of the Burgundians was a tougher work and occupied not only himself, but his successors, from 499 to 532. Theodoric the Ostrogoth, 437 to 526. Great, however, as Clovis was, and strangely powerful as was the impetus which survived him, he was not the arbiter of the West, nor was the Frank kingdom to approach the majesty of empire for nearly 3 centuries after his time. Theodoric, the great king of the Ostrogoths, occupied a far more important position both before and after the death of Clovis, and although Theodoric was brother-in-law to Clovis, and no doubt quite willing that he should subdue the north, as he himself did the south of the empire, it was by no means his purpose that Clovis should take all. Hence, as he sustained the Visigoths in Septimania, he sustained the Bavarians in Germany, and it was not until after his death in 526, and the collapse of the Ostrogothic power that the Franks acquired even the nominal supremacy in Gaul or in South Germany either. In northern Germany they were still less powerful, for the Saxons continued in their old seats as savage and independent as ever. And although the East Franks seem to have gradually admitted the dominion of the Merovingians, and the border states between the Saxons and the Bavarians to have rejoiced in Frank protection, their relations with the Bavarians themselves were anything but heartily friendly. However, although the Burgundians continued to struggle against the Franks for many years after the death of Clovis in 511, the Alemannian country seems to have been quickly consolidated, being annexed with Thuringia and Alemannia to Austrasia by King Theodoric, and in or about 532, the Bavarians, unsupported, gradually fell into an uneasy sort of dependence. In the flourishing period of the Lombards, the Franks acted occasionally as nominal allies of the empire, which, owing to the efforts of Belisarius was enabled to retain a hold on Italy, and so long as the Lombards were practically rivals to the Franks, the Bavarians maintained an alliance with the Lombards. The Lombard power, however, declined almost as quickly as it rose. Lombard power, 6th century, whilst that of the Franks went on increasing. In spite of the weakness of the princes, by the middle of the 7th century, it may be said that Germany, with the exception of the Saxons in the north, was nominally Frank and nominally Christian. But in the meantime, new names are appearing for the partitioned empire of Clovis, and under the descendants of Clovis, we find a kingdom of Neustria and a kingdom of Austrasia added to the ancient divisions of Aquitaine and Burgundy. The kingdom of Neustria embraced all that part of modern France which was not included in Aquitania or Austrasia. It was France between the Loire and the valley of the Meuse, the Silva Carbonaria north of Ardennes being the boundary. Austrasia comprised the German possessions of the house, Franconia, Alemannia, the nominal command of Bavaria, and the Ripuarian territory of western France, including the country which was afterwards Champagne. The division emerges about the year 561. Austrasia, of course, was the territory of the East, or Eastern Franks, a name which still belongs to the most Frank remnant of it, Franconia. The rest was Neustria, i.e. non-Austria, as it is said. Paris was the capital of Neustria. Metz, the capital of Austrasia. Of the sovereigns of either we know little to recommend them to our memories. What little we can retain shows that the reigning house was subject to alternations of energy and faineantism. That it did not break up permanently into two dynasties, but was continually being consolidated and subdivided, and that the moral and political character of the princes was such as combined the worst evils of barbarism with the worst evils of civilization. It is to Gregory of Tours that we are indebted for the most part for our knowledge of the Merovingians, and as was natural, his attention is devoted far more to the Neustrian than to Austrasian matters. It is thus with reference to the history of France rather than to that of Germany that he is chiefly studied. When he leaves us, we have for a long period only very scanty annals, and those still French, or rather concerning what is now France. But now, while the Merovingian house still retained a sort of unity under the influence of the servants of that house, their dominion was rapidly breaking into two, nearly by the very line that in ancient times had separated the Salians from the Ripuarians, and lowered down Gaul from Germany, the empire from the independent tribes. Though Neustria and Austrasia might often have the same king, they had two rival officers, mayors of the palace as they were called, who were gradually advancing to the position of kings and ultimately to the title of which the Merovingians were to be deprived, and then to the empire itself. The mayor of the palace of Austrasia was the real king of Germany. The mayor of the palace of Neustria was becoming king of France. It never actually was so. Before the Merovingian house in its degradation had destroyed the unity of the Frank dominion, the mayor of the palace of Austrasia had overcome his rival and founded the house from which the great Charles proceeded. In 638, Dagobert I, who 8 years before had united the whole dominion, died, leaving Sigebert II king of Austrasia, and Clovis, the second king of Neustria and Burgundy. Sigebert had for mayor of the palace Pippin of Landen. Grimoald, Pippin's son, succeeded him as mayor, and on the death of Sigebert in 656 endeavored to place his own son, Childebert, on the throne to the exclusion of Dagobert II. The attempt cost him his life. For the moment, Neustria gained the supremacy, with Erchinoald for sole mayor, Childeric II, and Clotaire III. The two sons of Clovis II In the same year, 656 redivided the states. Childeric with Wulfad for mayor in Austrasia, Clotaire with Ebroin for mayor in Neustria. But the house of Pippin of Landen was not extinct. His daughter, Bega, married Ansegi, son of S. Arnulf, who bore the title of Duke of Austrasia, and their son, Pippin of Herstal, was nourishing deep designs. In 679, Dagobert II, the successor of Childeric, died, and Austrasia, under Martin, son of Wulfad, and Pippin, son of Ansegis, refused the authority of Thierry of Neustria, wielding by the mayor Ebroin. In a battle in 680 near Laon, Ebroin beat his rivals, but did not live long enough to recover Austrasia. He died in 681. For 6 years, Pippin, who had rid himself of his colleague Martin, governed alone. In 687, he beat Berthair, the mayor of the Palace of Neustria, at the Battle of Testri, and took the king prisoner. Henceforth, although mayors for Neustria are still appointed, they are appointed by Pippin. In 1714, he appointed his grandson, a boy of 6 years old, mayor to the king Dagobert III, who was 15. One phantom. As Montesquieu says, set over another phantom. He himself governed Austrasia for 34 years, and the whole Frank dominion for 27. He died in December 714. The same year was born the third and greatest Pippin, son of Charles Martel and father of Charles the Great. In these dreary details, dreary details, we see little of Germany. The internal struggles of the Frank monarchy occupy the whole energy of the mayors, but for this, the lingering remnant of Lombard Empire and the exarchate of Ravenna itself must have long ago fallen before the energy of the North German races. But now the Agilolfings in Bavaria were drawing nearer to the Lombards and even aspiring to act as arbiters between the two races. In 708, Theodo IV was strong enough to place his own ward, Luitpert, on the throne of Lombardy and drew the cords of alliance closer. But the power of the Austrasian princes for half a century before this had been defied by the Bavarians. King Dagobert, between 630 and 638, had reformed the Bavarian laws, but this was the last act of authority exercised by the Merovingians. Theodo III, who became Duke of Bavaria in 612, married a daughter of King Theodebert of Austrasia and became a Christian. Theodo VI, who reigned from 653 to 660, although bearing only the title of Duke, governed his states without any pretense of subordination to the king of government at Metz. And his descendants persevered in the same independent course until they were conquered by Charles Martel. To this point, then, there is very little on which much criticism can be bestowed. Saxony is still heathen and independent. Alemannia is consolidated with Franconia as the territory of the kings of Austrasia at Metz. Bavaria has obtained a prescriptive but precarious independence. In the next chapter, an attempt will be made to clear the way towards the appreciation of the position of Germany under Charles the Great. There are one or two considerations which ought not to be overlooked. In the first place, although it is a great mistake to regard the Merovingians and the house of Pippin, from which Charles sprang, as French in the modern sense of the word, or indeed as anything but German in every sense, It is nevertheless certain that Neustria, or modern France, was much more completely subject to them, and more thoroughly and regularly organized than Austrasia, much more than those further portions of the German land, which, like Bavaria, lay practically beyond the limits of the Austrasian half of the dominion. Saxony and Thuringia were frequently at open war with the Franks, while Bavaria only in very imperfect subjection, and that under a brave race of native princes, was strong in foreign alliances, and deemed herself as a nationality and a national sovereignty nowise inferior to the descendants of Clovis. German or Eastern France had indeed been without that civilization and training that Neustria had had from the Romans, and, with the exception of the close neighborhood of the Rhine, was far more thinly inhabited and far more purely German than any portion of the Western kingdom. The difficulties of the Merovingians in Germany were then owing rather to imperfect civilization and neighbor war than to the internal and more political quarrels, which were the result of a higher organized and more ancient civilization in the other half. The dynastic quarrels and the political or open struggles for the mayoralty and for the substance of royal power took place accordingly either in Neustria or in that part of Austrasia which was more like Neustria, the western and more anciently settled territory on the Rhine. Hence, in Germany proper, we have much less incident and much less interesting incident. Another point closely connected with this is that, although we regard the Merovingians as permanently and finally set aside by Charles Martel, although not formally disposed of until the following reign, we are not to suppose that this arrangement was acquiesced in at all pleasantly or succeeded by a season of perfect peace. It was far otherwise. The reign of Charles Martel was a continual series of struggles. The great territory of Aquitaine was still possessed by a branch of the Merovingians, which did not share the general decadence of the family, and this was a source of difficulty down even into the reign of Charles the Great. But even the raffinement of Noyon and Metz was not entirely a puppet, or at least a puppet of Charles Martel, and had still rival mayors of the palace to set up in opposition to the Duke of Austrasia. The result of this is that although Charles and his house were decidedly Austrasian, or German in original position, the greatest part of their action lies in Neustria, and Germany proper has less recorded history now than it deserves. Several isolated campaigns were fought by Charles with the Frisians, the Saxons, and the Bavarians, which may be summed up briefly. But on the whole, it is not surprising that Frenchmen, and indeed some historians regard both him and Pippin as Frenchmen, their bones lie in the great sanctuary of the French at Est-Denis, and the great exploit by which Charles is best remembered, the Battle of Tours against the Moors, and his great constitutional act, the secularizations of church property, belonged to Western France. Charles the Great, on the other hand, was a German of the Germans in life and death. The reign of Charles Martel lasted from 715 to 741. During that time, besides his more famous wars with Aquitaine and with the Moorish invaders, and his constant internal difficulties, he fought the following campaigns with the independent Germans. In 716, he was attacked by Frisians under Radbod, their king, and the same year by the Saxons. He seems to have been actually beaten by the Frisians. He was then, in fact, in his greatest difficulties, the Merovingian king being still powerful on the Rhine, having, however, in 716 got possession of Cologne, and of the treasures of his father Pippin. He administered a severe rebuke to the Saxons, overrunning their territory as far as the Weser. In 725, he brought the Bavarians under his sway, defeated the Dukes Grimoald and Hugobert, and humbled them so thoroughly that they did not venture to stir during the remainder of his reign. He himself, to secure the peace, married a Bavarian princess, and gave one of his daughters as wife to Odilo, the son of Hugobert, who succeeded to the Bavarian throne in 739. In 732, at the Battle of Poitiers, he overthrew the Arabs and saved Aquitaine. In 733, he defeated and slew Poppo, Duke or King of the Frisians. In 734, he again defeated them. In 738, he conquered and made tributary the whole of the south of Westphalia, between the Lippe and the Rhine. In 741, he died, leaving his dominions between his sons, Pippin and Carloman. Pippin to have Neustria, Burgundy, and Provence. Carloman to have Austrasia, Alemannia, and Thuringia, with of course, the later conquest of his father from the Saxons and Frisians. But although in one sense these events are nearly all that is known of Germany during this period, in another sense it becomes apparent that a very important change was going on amongst the independent nations. They were being Christianized. The reign of Charles Martel and Pippin is in fact the great and most brilliant period of the missionary exertion of the Anglo-Saxon Church. And it was to Friesland and Saxony that her missions were sent. The missions of the Northumbrian Church were directed to Holland, as it now is, North and Western Frisia, and resulted in the formation of the Church of Utrecht, the mother Church of the Netherlands. The missions of the Scots were directed to the more southern parts of Germany, Franconia, Bavaria, and the mountains of Alemannia, and may be regarded as represented by the churches of Würzburg, Salzburg, and St. Gallen. The West Saxon missions went to the Old Saxon and the East Frisians under Boniface, the great English martyr of the 8th century, who was not only a great missionary, but a great reformer of the French and German churches, who baptized Charles the Great, consecrated Pippin to the kingdom, and who, as much perhaps as any man, contributed to bring about that accord between the court of Rome and the family of Pippin, which ultimately resulted in the establishment of the empire in the person of his son. There can be no doubt that the conversion of interior and northern Germany was a far greater step towards the consolidation of the empire than any cursory exploits of Charles Martel. But the effect was not yet apparent. And even 30 years after the death of Charles, very much remained to be done. Pippin and Carloman reigned jointly from 741 to 747. When the sovereign of Austrasia retired to Monte Cassino on the plan of the English and especially the Northumbrian and West Saxon princes who had exchanged the crown for the tonsure. During these 6 years he signalized himself as a warrior, little less than did his brother, joined Pippin in plundering their third brother Grippo of the small territory bequeathed by his father, and in humbling in Neustria and Austrasia, in Aquitaine and Germany, the enemies of the house. In particular, Dietrich, king of the Saxons, who maintained a brave and obstinate resistance, was defeated by Carloman in 743 and taken prisoner in 744. In 745, Saxony was again attacked and the people, to some extent, compelled to receive baptism. Odilo, Duke of Bavaria, was also attacked, notwithstanding a strong papal inhibition in 743, and only allowed to retain his dominions at the intercession of his wife, the sister of Pippin and Carloman. In 747, Carloman, after a vigorous reign, abdicated. Pippin Pippin le Bref, sole king, 751 to 768. In 751, Childeric was deposed, and that year saw Pippin sole sovereign of the domains of his house. For several years he continued an aggressive policy. Grippo, his brother whom he had released after the resignation of Carloman, fled from him to Bavaria, the administration of which he usurped after the death of Odilo. The struggle in Bavaria lasted until 751, when Pippin overcame Grippo and restored his nephew Tassilo. Before going into Bavaria, Grippo had raised the Saxons against Pippin, subjected the valiant Dietrich to a third imprisonment, and having exhausted and ruined his friends in Germany, he retired to Aquitaine and fomented war there. Ultimately, he perished in Lombardy in 753. But now Pippin was setting his mind on still greater things, and in the assumption of the title of king and in protection of the interest of the Pope. Protection of the interest of the Pope was opening up a new region of conquest and danger, for which a time again obscured the interests of Germany. In 752, he was consecrated king of the Franks by S. Boniface at Soissons. In 754, he was consecrated by Pope Stephen II at Esdenis. In 755, he invaded Lombardy and compelled Aistulfus to promise the cession of his conquests. In 756, he put an end to the Exarchate of Ravenna, the dominion of the Empire of Constantinople in Italy, and by giving it to the Pope, laid the foundation of the temporal power of the papacy. The remaining years of Pippin were taken up by wars in Saxony and Aquitaine, which he did not succeed in entirely subjugating. The war with Saxony, however, was continued in a chronic struggle, from year to year. In 755, Boniface suffered martyrdom in Friesland. In 757, Pippin received the solemn homage of Tassilo and all the Bavarian chieftains in a great assembly at Compiègne. In 758, after obtaining a victory, he compelled the Saxons to pay a tribute of 300 horses annually. From 760 to 763, he was engaged in war with Aquitaine. In 763, Tassilo deserted him and never returned to his allegiance. Pippin indeed made preparations for reducing him to order, but year after year passed before he could carry out his intention. Pippin died on the 24th of September 768, leaving a thick crop of troubles for Charles and Carloman.